Hey guys, it's Sarah Norris
And Carrie Eink
from the Star Institute for SPD, and we are going to be talking more about stories. And this week we're going to set up this the start of stories, where these stories begin. And so we're going to kind of give you some generalities about things we hear from people when they work with us the first time about what their discovery of SPD or sensory processing challenges in general, what that process was like for them. And I wish it was as straightforward like my doctor said, oh, it sounds like you might have sensory processing challenges. Here, read this book, look at this checklist. And that's pretty rarely the case.
Yeah, I think, thinking one of the things when we have individuals filling out the intake forms online, one of our questions is, how did you find out about us? How did you find out about SPD? And I think the majority of what I've heard from people is that you know that you have these specific challenges, and usually a lot of individuals, it starts with a web search. And here's what I'm feeling. What in the world could this be?
And it's pretty challenging because, as we've talked about before, SPD is not a recognized medical diagnosis just yet. And so there are definitely clinicians out there and doctors out there who don't believe in it. And so when you come in with your kind of web symptoms of this could be what I have, this explains a lot about me, so many of the adults that take that to their pediatrician or their primary care provider and say this is what I think is going on might get really dismissed, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, and I've even heard stories from individuals around the country, around the world, who even brought their symptoms or called an OT clinic who specializes in treating individuals with SPD, and the occupational therapists are saying, no, we only treat kids here, sorry. We just don't treat adults. So I'm not sure where you can go, which is really challenging. We know that SPD is a lifelong condition. It's neurological and lifelong. So, we're here to tell you that it is real. It does affect the entire lifespan. It looks very different throughout the lifespan, as we've talked about in several different videos, but can be really challenging, and hearing these individual stories about how they got to us through a consult, through an evaluation. It's typically not a short story of how they first thought about their sensory-based challenges and how they got to us.
So a lot of the stories we hear are really laced with persistence and no, I know something's wrong. I know that I'm not supposed to feel this way. I know that this isn't normal. And a lot of people have to be their own advocates with their doctors and in finding a therapist, and it's not an easy path for most people.
Yeah, and so commonly we hear the story of none of these other diagnoses fit. I just know that these don't fit. Once I saw this checklist, all of these symptoms or most of these symptoms, this is me. Or I read a book that I found on your guys' website, and finally somebody else's story matched my story. And it feels so good to be on the receiving end of that. We finally, were able to be a match for these individuals who had been seeking and persistence and finding the things that didn't work, and finally finding something that might be a hope of what they've been going through.
Yeah, so I think the whole process of discovering sensory challenges is confusing for a lot of individuals. And part of that is because it can look so different from person to person. And even if you meet someone else that says, hey, I've got some sensory challenges, chances are they may have one or two similarities with you, but then a whole host of other things that don't match. And I think there's some statistic about it. There can be over 3 million different combinations of SPD symptoms. So it's not like you find cookie cutters of yourself out there. You find people that think differently and who process things differently, and may have more sensitivities if that's like you, or they might be more sensory seeking or sensory craving, or they might just really have some coordination challenges. But when it comes to looking at the symptom checklists and the articles about sensory processing challenges, a lot of them are either very specific to one subtype of sensory processing challenges, frequently the sensitivities, or they're so broad that they cover all of the different subtypes and all of the different symptoms, and then it becomes really confusing because you might look at it and say, well, yes, that's me, but no, that's really not me. So I don't know where I fit in here.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
I think one of the things that I hear from individuals a lot is, I'm just so confused. Could this be a sensory processing challenge? I mean, it seems like it, but then there are things that I'm hearing or that I've read that just don't fit me, and that's confusing. And it's hard enough when you don't know yourself that great, because all of this has been confusing all your life.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the foundational reasons of kind of why us looking to you guys to share your stories. I think the more stories we can get from a variety of individuals, of a variety of ages, of a variety of occupations, a variety of different places that you live, learning the different stories, what we are knowing and what we can guess is that they're all going to be very, very different. Every individual that's come through the door and worked with me has a unique story. They have a unique profile. It all falls under this main umbrella category of sensory processing, but it looks very different. It impacts different occupations in your life. It impacts different relationships in your life, depending on where you're at.
And I think what makes it really interesting and why it's always fascinating to me is, after you've done this for a while, you start to pick up patterns, and sometimes you'll see, okay, well, you know, I've seen this before. I can assume that this might also be a symptom. Oh, nope. So even as clinicians, we see it all the time, and we work with individuals all the time, and we do see patterns sometimes, and there are things that we say, yes, we've heard that before, that sounds like this. There's still plenty of times where I make an assumption and I'm wrong, and so I have to be really careful about putting people in boxes, because that's not the way it works.
Yeah, and I know we talked in our last video about kind of the journey of how we created the adult program at STAR, and one of the really pivotal moments for me in starting this program was being able to connect with adults who were identified with SPD later in life. I know we've had Jennifer Allison and we've had Rachel Schneider in some of our Facebook Lives in the past telling their stories, and it just impacted and completely shifted a lot of the ways I worked, in really hearing their stories in depth and listening to them and about the successes they've had, the continued struggles that they have, kind of how they cope with it, their brilliance in telling their story and wanting to share it to the community. You know, I just think until we hear the stories and until we can start connecting the dots, that's when we can really start making sense of it, as professionals as well as other adults in the SPD community.
I also think it's important because it starts to peel back the layers of stigma around having a diagnosis like sensory processing disorder, because there's a lot of assumptions that people make about what a disability is and what it means for an individual. And we've worked with so many people that are at very different places in their life. Some of them are at a very low place and not doing well, and they're not able to function well, and they're really struggling. And we talk about them being in survival mode, and they're just trying to get through each day, and it's a struggle. But we also have individuals that we know and we work with that have made just really tremendous steps professionally and in relationships, and are functioning fairly well, but they're not satisfied, they're not enjoying life. And it's not depression, it's not anxiety, it's that things are hard, and it's hard for them to process all of the sensory experiences they have throughout the day. And it takes a toll when you don't have efficient sensory processing. It makes you tired, it makes you grumpy, and it's, like I said, it's not always necessarily just a depression or a mood disorder.
Yeah, I know one thing that we've talked about in prior videos is the arousal curve and what it can do when you're in really low arousal. You know, you're not at your fullest capacities. Conversely, when you're in a really high arousal, close to that fight or flight response, again, you're not at your highest capacities. And again, I'm seeing individuals who understand what their capacities are and what their capabilities are, but without proper arousal regulation from getting sensory-based evaluation or treatment, you're constantly kind of fluctuating between low and high arousal. And it's kind of like, there's like the thing you're chasing and you know what your capacities are, but you're just always missing it. It's kind of like this needle in a haystack type analogy, and that can lead to a lot of stressors and a lot of things that look very similar to anxiety and depression. And so it's, a lot of these individuals, like we've told you, they're some of the most brilliant people that I've met personally, and they know what their capabilities are, and they just need that extra assistance to get there and to be there for longer periods throughout the day.
I think you really pinpointed what we do with people when they come and they're saying, I just need to understand, I need to know if this is real, I need to know what to do with this. Because it's this place of feeling stuck. And it's also a place of feeling out of control no matter how hard you try. And feeling like there are those moments where I can see my potential and I'm locked in and it feels wonderful, but I can't sustain and it goes away and I don't know how to get it back, and I just feel like I don't know what to do. I just hear that all the time. And I think when we share our stories about what that journey is like for us, and our clients share their stories with us, it gives us that glimpse into their lives and into their potential. But we're able to be a step back and say, I can see that, and that is really hard. But by being an outside person, we can work more on the treatment side of helping. But at the beginning stages, especially as people are just discovering that sensory processing challenges explain a lot of their stressors, it's really that path of self-discovery of, wait a minute, so that might be why I do this. Oh, that explains why that happened with that person that time. Things like that just start to click into place and make you feel like you're actually a human being.
Yeah, so as we said, we're going to have associated blog posts with this series. So in the coming weeks, you're going to see our personal stories as well as some stories of the identification of sensory-based challenges. So be on the lookout for those, and we'll just continue on this series.
Thank you, guys.